Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to our Tuesday talk show. So this one's delayed because I've had like 3 recordings of this and I've had to redo it because I keep listening and thinking, there's more I want to talk about. I want to edit it out and I want to change it. So I've done a lot of takes of this particular one because it's a tricky topic, and we're going to be talking today about the persona, the shadow, the self, and the unconscious mind. And it's very difficult to talk about any of these things without talking a little bit about all of the others. So we're going to go for a bit of a shallow view of these, and we're going to relate it all to the Persona franchise. But we're going to also try and dive deeper into each of these different elements as we sort of do further videos. In particular, stuff like the unconscious is very, very vital to Carl Jung's theories. But in any event, let's start off by talking about the unconscious. So to Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, this is a very important part of the human mind. The concept of the Freudian slip is an example of the unconscious bubbling up to the surface of the conscious mind and causing you to say something that you don't necessarily intend to say, but deep down it is something that you want to say. It's sort of trying to get at something that you don't have a conscious grasp of in your own psyche. So to Freud and Jung and many other psychologists, and to still psychologists to this day, the mind is something that's much more complex than we ourselves grasp when we're sort of going about our day-to-day lives. So in the Persona series, this is represented by these very complex, intricate worlds that are very distorted or what have you. And this is most evident in Persona 4. There's not a whole lot of the individual unconscious mind in Persona 3 per se. One could make the argument that the Velvet Room falls into that category, but it's difficult to say precisely what that is for me, because there's some arguments that I can make that says that the Velvet Room should be considered part of the unconscious mind of the protagonist, which is why it's so different every time. But there could also be different elements that sort of guide me to believe that it's part of the collective unconscious, which we're going to get to as well. So essentially, the regular unconscious is this part of your mind that you're not directly aware of, that you can't think of, that you cannot call knowledge up from directly, but which influences your thoughts and behaviors and what you do when you're interacting with people and what you say. So if, for example, the classic example is you would say, what was that joke from The Simpsons? I think it was where Principal Skinner says something about his smother, when of course he meant it actually his mother, but in actuality his inner psyche, his inner unconscious mind was telling him that his mother is smothering him, and that's not something that he's consciously necessarily willing to admit, and that's is something that he sort of lets slip there, and that's sort of the classical Freudian slip there. Just like how I was about to say Floydian slip, because apparently I'm thinking about Pink Floyd in my subconscious mind. Really don't know why, but I do like Pink Floyd, but I like a lot of other bands as well, so maybe it's because that's a name that's sort of similar to Freud. But in any event, this sort of concept is one that people sort of look into and analyze and so on and so forth, but it's difficult to validate or verify because, of course, the unconscious mind is something that we can't directly or easily analyze. Now, in the individual cases of Persona 4, we do see these very well-realized worlds that are part of the inner psyche of these individual characters, but we also see that this is where the shadow resides, and this is something that does fit within Carl Jung's ideas about what the shadow is and of the unconscious mind. The shadow is an element of the unconscious. We're not consciously aware of it, we don't know about its presence, and it does have some sort of influence on our lives from that sort of dark recess of wherever it is. Now, the shadow is not actually necessarily only evil or primal thoughts that we have. We can compare and contrast this to the id that we talked about last week. The id is only our animalistic, bestial, instinctive urges. That's not true for the shadow, according to Carl Jung. According to Carl Jung, it is simply the parts of ourselves that we reject, that we don't believe in, that we distance ourselves from psychologically and try to forget about, or do forget about, since they're no longer part of the conscious mind. Now, to Carl Jung, one of the major differences is that, in particular for people with low self-esteem, for example, very positive traits can reside within the shadow. And this is why, strictly speaking, like for Kanji Tatsumi, for example, his shadow contains elements of his creativity, his passion for crafts and stuff like that. All these effeminate crafts and so on and so forth that he rejects from his outward sort of appearance about himself that he doesn't want to respond to. Now, while they're sort of cast in a negative light by the shadow in that particular game, those elements about himself are actually constructive and would actually help him quite a bit in his life. They're sort of skewed by his perception of those traits, though. So while they themselves might appear to be hostile or whatever, the actual shadow itself is not necessarily made up of negative elements. It's overall considered a negative construct, but it's not like the id in Freud's model. And I think that the major difference between their theories comes from the sort of different backgrounds that they're approaching this problem from. I think that Sigmund Freud is much more scientific in the way he views the human experience, because he views us as being essentially animals. He views us as being a creature that has those animalistic drives and instincts, but then he has to explain how it is that we form societies and how we function in societies and how we don't act on those animal impulses that we would otherwise simply act on. If we were, for example, a gorilla, we would see something that we want and we would just go over and take it. Or we would cower in fear if some larger animal was taking that instead, or a variety of different things based on those sort of instinctive reactions. Excuse me. Humans, on the other hand, interact in a socially complex way that means that we sometimes deny ourselves things that we want, or that we allow other people to take it, or we try to get things that we want in a very roundabout, complicated way, and so on and so forth. So we go through a much different sort of way of acquiring things than those other animals. And the id, ego, superego model, I think, is a way of explaining away the sort of explaining how we act as a society rather than acting as individual animals. I think Carl Jung, however, approaches the problem differently. I think that his background was not necessarily as medical or clinical as Freud's was. And I think that when he approached the problem, he viewed it as more of a spiritual thing, and he viewed that humans were already something separate and distinct from animals in a very broad sort of sense there. So he approached the problem, I think, in the sense that the shadow is the sort of inner being that we sort of have to confront, whereas for Freud it was simply an animal instinct component of the brain. So very, very different theories and very different elements there. So this is why when we talk about the shadow in Persona 3, we end up seeing something a little bit wonky going on here, because Persona 3 doesn't view the shadow or the unconscious quite in the same way as we see it in Persona 4 or even Persona 5. So in Persona 3, the unconscious is not really present. There's the collective unconscious, which I assume is the midnight hour, but there's no individualized states that show a specific person's unconscious mind, nor are there individual shadows represented for that person. Instead, you've got essentially the Nyx, the antagonist of the series, which is essentially the collective shadow of the death drive of all the people of the world. That's sort of the main antagonist of the series. So that entity is essentially the shadow of all of humanity in a certain context, but this is blending Freud's and Jung's ideas, and that doesn't work too elegantly because they're not necessarily mutually compatible theories. But there's definitely analogs between each of these constructs. Now, the unconscious mind is something that can be directly transferable between both of them. Both Freud and Carl Jung believed in an unconscious mind. So we could definitely look at that from a similar lens from both sides. The shadow and the id, while different constructs, are comparable. And the persona and the superego are also very analogous constructs, and you can definitely see the inspiration taken from Freud that Jung has. There's no direct great analog, in my opinion, for the ego in Jung's model, but it's also not as necessary, since it's sort of a superfluous step to a certain degree there. But in any event, what we see in Persona 3 is just this sort of collective unconscious and the focus of the shadow that resides within that, represented by the death drive. And this isn't really how either of their theories works, so this is why it's a little bit clumsy in my opinion. But it does sort of fit the themes and the ideas quite well, so I'm not going to criticize it too harshly. After all, it is a game. It's not meant to be an accurate representation of any of these guys' theories in a verbatim sense there. But we do see one that is actually fairly verbatim in Persona 4. We see those individual unconscious worlds of the individual. I'm not necessarily sure that Carl Jung would state that the unconscious mind resides within the collective unconscious, in the sense that the collective unconscious is a hub which connects all the unconscious minds, but maybe that is what he would refer to. If I recall correctly, though, he referred to it as being the that you could emerge into the unconscious mind, and then beyond that, going further from that, you end up in the collective unconscious. So in that sense, you're sort of doing things backwards in Persona 4. In fact, you do many things backwards in Persona 4, but we'll get to that in a little bit there. But residing within your unconscious mind, you find your shadow, and this is something that sort of you can either reject or you can sort of embrace it, or however you want to interact with it, and it's different for all the people that sort of talk to it. But typically speaking, confronting the shadow is part of individuation, according to Carl Jung's theories, that sort of confronting of one's negative self that they sort of reject otherwise, and either coming to terms with it in some way. And this is something that you actually see people doing in the Persona 4 game. But again, not something that you see in the Persona 3 game, not even with the amalgamation of Freud and Jung's ideas. So far, what we've seen in Persona 5 thus far is just the unconscious mind of the individuals that they discuss. I haven't really seen any sort of hub that connects these together yet, but I'm only about 3 hours into the game. So we'll be analyzing that more deeply and seeing what they're implying as we go further into it. But we could be seeing that these games are becoming more and more close to Carl Jung's vision of these ideas. Now, the next sort of construct that we want to talk about is, of course, the shadow. And like I said, the shadow is somewhat analogous to Freud's idea of the id. It is your sort of negative self and contains your negative self-perceptions, as well as, more importantly, it's your rejected self identity. Now, the shadow is actually a part of the true self, unlike the persona. It is part of who you actually are, whereas the persona is something that you project to other people, which might not actually be representative of your actual self. Because of this, the shadow is actually much, much more closely tied to your identity as a person than the persona is, even though the persona is what you see on a regular basis and other people would judge you on, whereas the shadow, which people don't see and don't judge you on, is much, much more closely tied to who you actually are. Now, in Persona 3, we see that there's no direct shadows of the individuals. It's simply the monsters that exist in the outside world, or external to the characters and their psyches, essentially. But we do have to analyze one element of the shadow in Persona 3, and that is in relation to, again, the death drive. The death drive is something that resides within the Freudian id, but if we sort of translate it over to Jungian psychology, we have to sort of place it as a subconscious part of the human mind that we reject. So if we do take it for granted that there is a death drive, which Persona 3 I think does, it would reside within the shadow. It would be part of the human experience that we reject about ourselves, that's part of the unconscious mind. And the reason that we stay alive is because we continue to reject the death drive. But if we were to fully embrace it, rather than come to terms with it or reconcile ourselves with it, then we find ourselves looking like Revolver Jesus, who essentially is a nihilist who is literally embracing the concept of death for everybody. So this is something that, of course, would be quite a negative thing, and it's quite a good thing that we don't just go ahead and embrace it fully. But we do see some interesting things in the summoning of a persona in Persona 3, and that's going to come in a little bit later. Now, in Persona 4, they directly sort of interact with the shadow of themselves, and this is a very Jungian way of looking at it. It's simply just that sort of version of ourselves that we don't personally like, that we refuse to accept as ourselves. But according to Jung, part of the therapeutic process is actually in eventually confronting the shadow. But they get it a little bit backwards in Persona 4. To confront the shadow, what we first have to do in that sort of Jungian way is to remove the persona. By removing the persona, we lay exposed our unconscious mind, and by exposing that, we can sort of interact with it and sort of come to terms with that. And according to Jungian psychologists, that would sort of be the goal of therapy. Again, I'm not actually a Jungian psychologist. I don't really believe that the technique is really that scientifically valid, so it's not really my cup of tea. So if I'm getting things wrong about it, do not be surprised. I read up as much as I can about the subject, and I am familiar with the content, but I'm not experienced in its particularities, so there's going to definitely be people who are much, much, much more well-versed in that particular topic than I am. But in any event, by sort of removing the persona, by exposing the true self, we get to sort of catch a glimpse of all of these underlying constructs underneath that, and that lies in the unconscious mind. And in this particular part of the self, in the shadow, we can sort of either reject it out, and it continues to be there. And by strongly rejecting and refusing the shadow, what we end up doing is causing a strain in ourselves. It sort of leads to neurosis, according to the Jungian psychologists. And this constant strain against the self is very, very harmful to the identity of the person. It can lead us to fully embracing a persona, and according to Jung, you do not want to over-embrace the persona because we risk losing the self. And by losing the self, we simply become a soulless mask, essentially, which would, of course, be also a bad thing. You have to use all of these things in moderation in Jungian psychology. So the shadow is something that we are supposed to reconcile with. We're supposed to figure out what parts of it we can use, what we can adopt. And this, again, I think does appeal a little bit to Freud and his idea about the id. We're not supposed to outright reject the demands of the id. We're supposed to come to a mutual conclusion about how we're supposed to get the id what it wants without really doing anything harmful. And the shadow is kind of like that in a sense, but it could also simply mean recognizing the good parts of it and directly embracing those. It could mean saying that, yeah, this is something that I dislike about myself, but I'm going to improve on that. That's another way that you can look at the shadow. And there's lots of different other ways that you can reflect the shadow from the unconscious mind into the conscious mind, and by doing so, you change it from being part of your shadow, part of the unconscious, into something else. Now, you'll still always have an unconscious mind, and you'll always still have a shadow, but this is a process that sort of diminishes the shadow's influence over you and allows you greater control as an individual, as your true self. So next up would, of course, be the persona. And the persona is, simply put, how you present yourself to the world around you. It is an act. Everyone is an actor when they talk to another person. They're not their legitimate true selves. They talk about things that they think that that person might want to hear about. They act in a way that is polite, in a way that they think that those people find socially acceptable. Or if they're trying to be someone that is rebelling against that, they do so in a way by thinking, well, how would someone who wants to rebel against the society and etiquette, how would they act? But none of that's actually necessarily reflective of the true self. It's not necessarily the same thing as embracing the shadow, even if you're acting out against society. What you could actually be doing is putting on a facade of rebellion when you're in actuality just frustrated with something else completely. And these sort of faces that we put on are designed to help us sort of interact with other people and cope with society. And this is, again, why I think it's sort of analogous to the superego. It's what it's what actually comes forward in our behavior and is visible to the outside world. While all the other underlying elements of the psyche and of the unconscious mind are sort of working behind the scenes there. In the Persona series, we typically see that they manifest in these characters as these sort of creatures that are made up of psychic energy and act as independent agents. Now, to me, this means that when they're summoning a persona, they're not necessarily actually putting on a mask. That wouldn't necessarily make sense in the Jungian sense. They're already putting on an act. They're already acting in a specific way in accordance to their personality, their behaviors, their sort of idioms, and so on and so forth. That is their mask. They're already wearing it. I think that when they're taking their persona and summoning it, they're actually separating the persona from themselves to allow it to act into the world as a free agent. So this is actually something that I think we can go through each of the series and talk about why I think that's the case, and we'll be doing that just about now, I think. So in Persona 3, we see the use of the evokers as a way to summon the persona, and I think that this is how the mechanics behind it are working. And they're sort of consistent throughout the series up till 5, and including 5 in fact. But what you're doing by pointing the evoker at yourself is you're creating an act. You're essentially making a mask of somebody who has sort of embraced death, who is willing to die, who is charging straight forward into oblivion, as it were. But this is just an act. The gun is a prop. It is a toy. It doesn't actually kill you, obviously. But it does do two other things. While you're doing this, we go back to Freud here. You're drawing from yourself your shadow. You're now putting the shadow that hides the death drive from the unconscious mind and bringing it to the forefront. You're saying to the world that you've embraced this death drive. And by doing so, they temporarily sort of push the shadow into the conscious mind and out of the unconscious. And so that shadow is no longer really sort of there as a shadow anymore. That's now actually a persona. It's now part of your public facade because it is now your act. By doing so, they also symbolically destroy the self. By destroying the self and by destroying the shadow and sort of changing the shadow into a persona, all that is left of the individual is their persona. There's actually other unconscious constructs, but those don't seem to matter here. All that seems to matter is the symbolic destruction of the self and of the turning of the shadow into the persona. The same thing happens in Persona 4. We see that the individual characters all embrace their shadows, and in doing so, they're not necessarily saying that they fully embrace and respect that individual part of themselves. And in fact, we see through their individual character arcs as we explore their social links, they still aren't necessarily 100% comfortable about those elements in themselves. They reveal to the character that they're still coming to grips with that. So that still resides within their shadow, but they are willing to put it on their face to say that I've accepted this, that's something I've done that is brave, and that is allowed me to become part of this group here. And they sort of reflect that to the main character, and they sort of confide in him. But that's a mask that they're putting on to the main character. They're acting in that way in regards to you. But this also means that when they want to summon their persona, their shadow has essentially become part of their public facade. They're still conscious of their shadow, even if they do still reject parts of it. But their real acceptance of their shadow is, to a certain degree, now an act that they put on, and it allows them to sort of eliminate that and move it somewhere else. The annihilation of the self in Persona 4 is the crushing or the destruction of the Arcana card, which I believe more fully represents the actual self rather than the facade that people put on. The main character in both Persona 3, Persona 4, and Persona 5 embodies this idea, while for every other character, their persona is closely tied to their Arcana. And for the record, like, the facade that we put onto the real world is reflective of the sort of person that we truly are. You can sort of glean a lot from a person by seeing the sort of facade that they put out to the world. And people who are psychoanalysts will, and I mean Freudian psychoanalysts, will actually derive a lot from a person's public facade. For example, they'll give the attributes of someone who's very, very narcissistic, for example. They might assume that that's actually just a masked cover-up in hidden insecurities beneath that. And we do sort of tend to see that sort of happening, and that sort of idea that there are people who have very, very inflated egos on the outside, actually have really, really low self-esteem on the inside, is not exactly entirely discredited exactly. So to see that destruction of the self in the Persona 4 series and Persona 3 series, we only really see that in the main characters because they're able to switch their faces, but they maintain their core identity and their core self. The core self would be, in their case, the Joker. So if it weren't for them, it would be very, very hard to come to this conclusion because they're so interlinked between and everybody else. But for the main character, they're so disparate from each other. The public face that you're putting on compared to the inner self, it makes it clearly obvious that the Arcana represents something other than the persona itself. So in that particular case, each of the characters destroys the Arcana card that represents the true self, and by doing so, again, they've embraced the shadow, moved it to the persona, they've destroyed the self. The persona is now free to act in the world as an individual and free agent. At least that's my interpretation of the way that they're doing this. And I think this is the most sort of Jungian interpretation of the way things are happening. Persona 5 is interesting because it breaks from this mold, but in a way that sort of confirms all the ideas that I've had about the other games. In Persona 5, you simply rip your mask off in a very physical and literal way. Each of the characters has a mask that sort of they wear that represents what they view as rebellion. And this is their sort of rebellion persona, essentially, their anarchist persona or whatever, what have you. It doesn't really represent who they truly are, what they truly believe in, but it's the face that they're willing to put on in the face of this sort of adversity against these extreme social and literal shackles that they're faced with. So, but what we see is kind of interesting because these people are not destroying the self or moving the shadow from the shadow into the persona. So what happens with these individuals? Well, we see the characteristic sort of golden eyes of these individuals during their first transformation, as well as the sort of ominous dark glow about them and fire and so on and so forth, that is characteristic of constructs of the unconscious mind. So, for example, characters like, say, Elizabeth and characters like, say, Margaret or Caroline or Justine, for example, or any of the characters' shadows, all have these bright golden eyes, and that's representative not necessarily of shadows, but of any of the beings of the unconscious. But in this particular case, when the characters adopt that after they rip their masks off for the first time, I think that that is simply reflective of the fact that they've taken off their personas. And like I said, removing the persona is how you come to look at the shadow of the individual. By removing that, we now see the character's shadow laid bare. And I think that this is why we see physical changes to the characters outside of just them externally summoning something to act as a free agent on the outside world. These characters don these different suits and so on and so forth that I think are reflective of their inner shadows and of their inner selves, their unconscious minds. And it's because they are summoning their persona, they're removing their mask without eliminating the shadow or annihilating the self that this happens. So they're undergoing physical changes to the self to sort of, because this is what these people look like without their persona, without their mask on, without that act holding them back. So I think that that's going to be what that is, but that's just a theory and conjecture at this point in time. Maybe it won't be confirmed as such, but that does seem to be the case here. And like, it would not surprise me, like, people in other games have theorized or described summoning a persona as putting on a mask. I think it is the exact opposite of that, and I think that that's why it's so appropriate to see it the way it's happening in Persona 5. But in any event, that's all we're going to be talking about really for today. This is a long and lengthy topic that I would like to delve into a little bit more. But yeah, that's our sort of look at the unconscious mind, how it appears in Persona, the shadow, how it sort of appears in the different Persona games. We haven't directly seen much of the shadow in Persona 5 yet, other than the fact that we do see the individual's shadows of whoever's collective or whoever's unconscious mind we're talking about, but we've also talked about the personas. So anyway, I'm liking the game so far. We'll play some more and we'll talk some more about it next week. So hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.